For the past century, Russian history has also been the history of its security services. They were used by the Soviet state to crush dissent. Millions suffered at their hands. But while many things may have changed in today's Russia, its security network is arguably stronger than ever. And the reason behind that is the rise of a lowly lieutenant colonel to president of this vast country.
I know the KGB better than anyone else because I was part of the inside circle.
This is the story of the KGB, told by its veterans and its victims.
Советское население делится на заключенных, бывших заключенных и будущих заключенных.
In a Moscow comedy club, young people laugh at life as it was, living in the shadow of the KGB. The jokes, compiled from the archives, show how humor was often the last refuge under an authoritarian regime.
A joke is one of the main ways of dealing with stress. It can help you live with the things you can't change.
Misha Melnichenko has unearthed almost 6,000 Soviet political jokes.
One day, Stalin lost his pipe and ordered his security chief Beria to investigate. A bit later, he calls Beria and says, "Don't worry, I've found the pipe." Beria replies, "But we've arrested 100 people, and 99 of them have confessed." Stalin exclaims, "Only 99? Continue the investigation."
In reality, life for most Soviet citizens was no laughing matter. This recently opened KGB archive in Kiev contains millions of documents. It records the fate of hundreds of thousands sent to the gulags and tens of thousands more sentenced to death. Those who suffered at the hands of the KGB and KGB officers themselves are well placed to tell us about the biggest state security network the world has ever known.
On the third day, they led you into a cell to take your fingerprints. This is me. Prisoners called this playing the piano.
They came one December night and arrested me.
They pushed guns through our cell windows and opened fire.
They'd shot people without trial. God knows what else they did.
Also inside these boxes, there are untold stories of heroism, where KGB agents put their lives on the line to protect their country and Soviet rule.
We truly believed that we were protecting our country because the KGB was one of the most powerful secret services in the world.
Usually it is associated with some kind of enforcement of violence. But I'm very proud to be a member of the intelligence service.
Russia, the largest country on Earth. Misunderstood by many and feared by even more. Invaded repeatedly over the centuries, its leaders have adopted a siege mentality to counter real or perceived threats from abroad. Russia's people have been encouraged to view foreigners as the enemy.
I want to be a citizen of the world. and I want to be on good terms with the rest of the world. But they tell me that this is an enemy, and that is an enemy, and those over there are also enemies. But why is he an enemy? Maybe I just want to love him.
Enemies have been a preoccupation throughout Russian history. In modern times, those enemies, inside and out, have been the target of surveillance, assassinations, honey traps, and hacking scandals. The story of the KGB began over a century ago with a revolution. After the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, Lenin founded a secret police force as a temporary measure. It was called the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, or Cheka for short. The name changed several times in the last century, including OGPU, NKVD, MGB, KGB, and finally FSB. But even today, agents refer to themselves as Chekists. KGB Colonel Anatoly Sakno recalls the ethics that were drummed into him as a young recruit.
A Chekist, we were told, had to have a cool head, warm heart, and clean hands. It was drilled into us from our very first day. It went into our heads, hearts, our souls.
There is a myth of this high morality, of this moral purity of the Chekists and other Knights of the Revolution, as they were called. In January 2018, only 12% of Russians said that they associate the Cheka as the Soviet secret police with terror and persecution of dissidents.
Their Moscow headquarters, the Lubyanka, quickly became notorious. Chekists were expected to crack down hard on all who opposed the state. The first head of the secret police was the son of a Polish Catholic aristocrat, Felix Dzerzhinsky. He soon earned the name Iron Felix.
Dzerzhinsky came from a strict Catholic background, and he had ambitions to become a priest. His mother and an uncle had to talk him out of this because they recognized that he was too fond of women to take up a job as a Catholic priest. But Dzerzhinsky didn't entirely abandon his Catholic beliefs. He carried over the ideals of a kind of Jesuit priest into the idea of what the perfect secret policeman was. Somebody who was part of society but withdrawn from society at the same time. Somebody with very strict moral values.
Everyone knew he was a man of iron, a man of integrity. Of course, he created a monster. It was a dreadful organization. Even some of Lenin's closest associates were afraid of the Cheka.
Back then, all these people were really committed communists. They had a very clear vision of the future for their country and for the world, and we wanted to start a world revolution. And it was a very big idea for many, and they were ready to sacrifice themselves, sacrifice the population of Russia.
From their imposing Lubyanka headquarters, the Cheka exercised seemingly limitless authority.
Only the best, cleverest, most reliable people were selected. So it was considered a great honor to be awarded your certificate as an officer of the KGB.
State-sponsored movies and novels also glamorized the security services through the exploits of men like Nikolai Kuznetsov, a Russian equivalent of James Bond. But while Bond was fictional, Kuznetsov was very real. Films depicted his daring behind German lines during the Second World War. Many aspiring agents fell under the Kuznetsov spell. One lad who dreamt that he'd join this prestigious organization was young Vladimir Putin.
when he was still at school, went to the local KGB office and said, how do I join? And even the KGB there were fairly disconcerted and basically said, well, run along, sonny, go to university and do a degree, and then maybe we'll talk.
When I was a young lad, I wanted to work for the state security services because I was influenced by the books and films of that time. It was deliberately romanticized.
I was very patriotic. I wanted to catch spies. I wanted to work in counterintelligence. All that romantic stuff that excites young people.
We would be the patriots who would protect the country. We were ready to sacrifice our lives for the country.
Once they had caught the bug, these idealistic and ambitious recruits underwent specialized training, including the dark arts of counterintelligence.
A KGB officer doesn't usually wear a uniform. These are the only photos of me in uniform. They were taken at the KGB Training Academy in Tashkent. We learned languages and learned to shoot. We learned the art of photography. There were professors, specialized research, and experienced professionals were assigned to train us. How to recruit, how to blackmail, to bribe, and to abuse.
In their fortress-like training center on the outskirts of Moscow, today's recruits are constantly reminded of Lenin's words, ironically borrowed from the Bible. Whoever is not with me is against me. Yet Lenin's secret police chief, Iron Felix Dzerzhinsky, constantly feared for his life, and he wasn't wrong.
He was a very cautious man. For example, in his office in the Lubyanka, there was an anteroom where his secretary worked, and a prisoner was in custody in the cells nearby. The man overpowered his guard, took his gun, and ran into the corridor. He was determined to shoot Dzerzhinsky. He burst into the anteroom, but he couldn't see a way into Dzerzhinsky's office because the door was hidden behind a wardrobe. To get in, you had to go through the wardrobe, and strangers didn't know about it.
But while Dzerzhinsky was always on his guard, his boss, Lenin, believed the revolution could defend itself.
Lenin had a rather naive attitude towards security, it seems. He said it'd be enough for the new Soviet state to arrest 50 to 100 leading bankers, expose their frauds, and the Russian people will then realize the horrors of capitalism. Dzerzhinsky said, no, you have to be more brutal than that. There are forces at large who wish to destroy the Soviet state. You need to not just arrest large numbers of people, but you need to terrify the opposition. So you need to kill large numbers of people.
Dzerzhinsky himself said, "We stand for organized terror. This should be frankly admitted. Terror is an absolute necessity during times of revolution."
The Soviet system, the Bolshevik regime, seized power. They didn't have the support of the people. For them, the nation, peasants, the countryside, military units were all suspect. And they decided to run the country with the use of undercover informers who reported on all spheres of Soviet life. Everywhere, from factories, small cooperatives, to the army, the Soviet regime trusted no one.
Convinced by Dzerzhinsky that saboteurs were everywhere, Lenin ordered a purge. A civil war had broken out, and between 1918 and 1920, over 100,000 people were executed by the Cheka. It became known as the Red Terror.
The Red Terror was indiscriminate violence. It could be shooting prisoners in the basements of the Lubyanka. It could be burning down villages. It could be putting prisoners on a boat and just sinking the boat, watching them all drown. It could be putting them in prison camps and letting them starve to death.
Dzerzhinsky, the man who might have become a priest, was now orchestrating mass murder. Religion was denounced as a competing ideology, but it had been ingrained in Russian culture for centuries and couldn't be replaced with atheism overnight. So while hundreds of churches were destroyed across the country and bishops and priests executed, those few allowed to continue were forced to work with Dzerzhinsky's security services. Only a fraction of the churches that existed in Moscow before the revolution remained in the 1950s. According to the research of a British exchange student in Moscow at the time, Michael Bordeaux.
In January 1918, Lenin himself passed the first anti-religious laws. He also took away church property. So religion and the Tsarist regime were put together as being fair game.
To neutralize what remained of the religious community, Dzerzhinsky's Cheka infiltrated it at every level.
I would go as far as to say that the ruling group of bishops was more or less a KGB agency.
The Communist Party found new uses for some church property. The dark elements of early Soviet history have become a special interest to historian Marsha Shilova.
This is the John the Baptist convent. In 1918, it was closed, and the Bolsheviks turned it into one of the largest concentration camps of the early Soviet era. As many as 800 prisoners were held here. Interestingly, the concentration camp and the convent somehow shared the space until 1926. 100 nuns continued to live here.
When Lenin died in 1924, Dzerzhinsky was instrumental in the ensuing power struggle. He helped sidetrack Trotsky, the heir apparent, and actively supported Joseph Stalin. His reward came when Stalin chose to expand the Secret Service. The new leader was determined to drag the Soviet Union into the 20th century at any cost. But his modernization would need vast manpower.
When Stalin began his forced modernization, the KGB became more important. Gulags were created. The role of the KGB in modernization is colossal.
Hundreds of thousands of agitators, criminals, and innocent people were deported to a system of camps called the Gulag.
The Gulag started out as a set of prison camps for the enemies of the party, the enemies of the revolution. Very quickly, though, it turned into something else. It had an economic function. The Bolsheviks saw that they had all these extra people, these useless people who really couldn't be used in any way by society. Why not put them to work for the state and help grow the state?
The Gulag system Dzerzhinsky pioneered was run mainly by the security services. It lasted for 60 years, though he died in 1926. Russian soap star Yevgenia Turkova's family was sent to Siberia in the 1940s, suspected of collaboration with the Nazis. The youngest were thrown into orphanages, the oldest to the Gulag.
That really is how the Ministry of Security, the state, influenced the lives of my family. They lied, deceived, and murdered people. It's a miracle that my family survived. They were supposed to die.
Самый большой любитель анекдотов – это Берия. Он их собирает вместе с рассказчиками.
In the old days, people could be arrested just for telling a joke. I told a joke.
When schoolteacher Vera Golubeva told a joke, she paid a terrible price.
In Moscow, in Tverskaya Street, they were planting trees along the boulevard. The joke was, the whole world is arming itself while we're planting flowers. That's all I said. But they came in the night and arrested me. I was 8 months pregnant and looking forward to motherhood.
Vera gave birth in custody. There were complications, and for a time she was unconscious. But eventually she came round.
When they brought me my dead baby, I passed out. They showed him to me. That's all.
At 99 years old, Vera still mourns.
It's deeply painful, even now. I feel like an orphan, alone in the world.
She lost her only child and was sent to the Gulag for 8 years, and it all started when she told a joke.
I'm sorry.
The reality is that much of Soviet modernization was achieved on the back of Gulag slavery.
Why, during the period of the Great Depression, when world economics were collapsing, especially in the US, Britain and France, why was Russia enjoying crazy growth? Because Stalin had complete control through the party and the security service.
Some Gulag survivors take comfort from the notion that they helped build a modern nation.
I was building a railroad, chopping wood and draining swamps. It was hard work for a woman. People needed the railroad. We understood that, and we all worked hard. All this work was for the benefit of the people.
The problem was that tens of hundreds of thousands of people were sent to these prisons. It was class warfare, very cruel. Today, the old and young generations condemn that whole system and consider it to be a grave mistake of Stalin and the policies of that time.
Through more than 6 decades, the Gulag system extracted forced labor.
The main feature of that work was that it was hard. If you refused to work, you are immediately punished. Many people didn't receive medical treatment. There was a lovely joke of our doctors to bring some dentists to the camp to make a hole, put arson in, and say, it will take a few days, then we will come back and finish. And they never came back. So you cannot repair by yourself. So it's permanent suffering. And
there was a special chamber where they held the most violent thugs. I understood that it was a press house. Prisoners there break, cripple, and kill people on the orders of the administration. When they put me into that chamber, I thought it was the end.
In a camp, you just have to survive. Every moment is a challenge to your dignity.
Human rights activist Sergei Kovalyov was one of the most prominent Soviet dissidents. He served 7 years in prisons, including the infamous Perm 36 Gulag, over 1,000 kilometers east of his Moscow home.
I've known some unfortunates who've been imprisoned every minute and every second of their lives. Every second they suffered the burden of imprisonment. They had nothing. They had no family. Their families were far away. They were miserable every second. It's horrible.
Even with the slave labor of millions, Stalin felt that modernization was progressing too slowly.
Stalin, taking his usual summer holiday in the Caucasus, meets one of the local secret police chiefs, Yevdokimov. Yevdokimov persuades Stalin that some of the problems they're experiencing in the Soviet state, notably the failure to rapidly industrialize, are the result of spies inside the mines and the factories.
To disguise the shortcomings of industrialization, a search for scapegoats began. Fears were spread, fear of the state and of each other, as Stalin mounted a show trial in the industrial town of Shakhty.
The Shakhty show trial was a way of mobilizing popular support in a pitchfork-style display of mob justice. Even though, when they carry in all the documents into the courthouse, the only real evidence they've got are the confessions of the accused. There's no other material evidence whatsoever.
Stalin declared the accused class enemies. 44 went to the Gulag, 5 were executed.
Stalin loved the idea of blaming other people for his mistakes. It had an economy to it which amused and pleased him. He loved the idea of forcing other people to stand in court and confess to crimes which he himself had committed.
Controlling a diverse population across vast territory was his constant concern. He seized on uprisings, real or imagined, to wield power against his enemies.
An army officer leading a unit of 400 men says Stalin is a traitor. The Soviet rule is counter-revolutionary. Trotsky's a hero, and the Kremlin should be seized.
Stalin was determined that he alone must rule. In 1936, he ordered a murderous crackdown that became known as the Great Terror. The security services were ordered to destroy all opposition, no matter how many innocents were caught up in the process.
Человека ведут на расстрел. Дождь, холодно. Он говорит, погода плохая. Конвойный ему отвечает, тебе ничего, а мне назад идти.
Stalin was the source of the terror. He personally signed the arrest lists for senior party officials. He was the top man in the hierarchy of terror.
His new henchman as chief of the secret police was Nikolai Yezhov. He was a ruthless and sadistic man, and Stalin kept him very busy.
Very quickly, the Great Terror moved into an attack on people who were inside the party, in many cases people who had been leaders of the party and who were now feared to be possible traitors to the party. In almost every party cell, there was a kind of hysterical self-examination process as people began looking for enemies within the ranks.
Orders were issued, different orders. Like, in your region, 50,000 people must be arrested. They're all counter-revolutionaries. In your region, let's say 30,000. In yours, 70,000 people. It doesn't mean that all the people who were killed in the Great Terror were conspirators. Of course, 99% were innocent.
It was execution on an industrial scale. Suspects were rounded up and delivered by the truckload to killing fields, including this one, just south of Moscow.
Security services usually received execution orders at the end of the day. Prisoners selected for execution were collected from various prisons. Shooting would usually start at dawn. To avoid panic and subdue the prisoners in transit, they came up with an absolutely savage idea. Exhaust fumes were piped into the truck where the prisoners were carried. They were breathing the noxious fumes for the whole journey. By the time they arrived, they were helpless. The remains of around 21,000 people lie here.
Yezhov was an important instrument for Stalin during the Great Terror. He was exactly the sort of person needed for this very dirty, very bloody task. It was in his nature to carry out these atrocious orders without protest.
During 1937 and 1938, nearly 700,000 people were executed, and over 1 million more sent to the Gulag. Their images were expunged from official photographs.
At first, everyone thinks that there's been a mistake because they see themselves as class warriors. Most of those arrested considered themselves good communists, so they couldn't understand what was going on. Then they fall into this machine which immediately dehumanizes them. You are stripped naked, locked in a cell and prevented from sleeping. They bombard you with ludicrous charges, then accuse you of spying for the English, Americans, Germans, Polish, French, Japanese, Chinese, all at once. And maybe you were planning to assassinate Stalin. You just can't process all this stuff. People always believe that there must have been some mistake, that this nightmare will end. But the only escape from this nightmare is the firing squad or Siberia. And once you're there, it is too late.
KGB chief Yezhov said there will be some victims. Better that 10 innocents suffer than 1 spy gets away. After 2 years of relentless killing, Stalin wanted someone to blame for the excesses. The head of the security services, Nikolai Yezhov, was arrested and executed.
This was Nikolai Yezhov's home. He had a modest apartment in this building. He was the bloodiest of them all. He was arrested in 1939 and shot in 1940. His remains now lie in the same mass grave as many of his victims.
Relatives have laid plaques for some of the 8,000 victims whose ashes lie here in a Moscow cemetery. There is no plaque for Yezhov. Stalin replaced him with fellow Central Committee member Lavrentiy Beria, a name that would become infamous in Soviet history. And yet his first act was the release of 100,000 political prisoners.
He wasn't a mass murderer like Yezhov. He tried to reduce that. But he was quite prepared to kill or incarcerate anyone who resisted the Soviet system.
Like Stalin, Beria was from Georgia, and he arrived with a cadre of trusted lieutenants. They soon established a more comfortable environment for their intrigues. The Aragvi. It became one of the most celebrated and infamous restaurants in Russia.
Everybody liked Georgian cuisine. Back then, it was the most exotic in Moscow. Soviet Chekists controlled the Aragvi from the very beginning. It was created under the patronage of the NKVD.
Beria himself helped set up the Aragvi. It would become a den for senior members of the security services.
Chekists met with diplomats here, and also with agents. Lavrenti Beria met his own agents here. He had quite a few that he ran personally. A lot of foreigners, English speakers from various countries came here. It was a good place for a quiet chat.
A quiet chat, perhaps, but it was said that every table had a hidden microphone.
Объявление в холле московской гостиницы. Товарищи, не гасите окурки в цветочных горшках. Вы можете повредить микрофоны.
Beria's intelligence network was also raising the alarm about activities beyond the Soviet borders. Hitler's German war machine had been growing since 1933.
All the USSR's resources went into the preparation of the army. But when in 1936 they held maneuvers in Ukraine and Belarus, it became clear that the army was not ready for war.
Countless officers of the Red Army had been executed in the Great Terror. Now Stalin needed time to rebuild it. In August 1939, he signed a peace treaty with Germany, agreeing to carve up Poland between them. Hitler, with his eastern flank secure, was ready for war. Just 1 week later, he invaded Western Poland. As German forces advanced, the Red Army moved to annex eastern Poland. Almost 500,000 Polish prisoners fell into Russian hands. Beria's security service took charge, sifting out military officers, priests, and the intelligentsia.
Intelligence officers were sent there to gauge the attitude of the Poles. What do they think of Russia? If Hitler attacks, would they fight for Russia against Hitler? When they had established that the Poles had a negative attitude against Russia, I think that became a reason to shoot them.
They woke us up a few minutes before 5 a.m. and divided us up into groups. The day hasn't started out well. We're piled into a prison truck with guards and driven into some forest. We're undergoing a thorough cavity search. They took my watch. The time was either 6:30 or 8:30 in the morning. They're asking for our wedding rings. But they took from me rubles, belt, pocket knife. What happens next?
On Beria's personal recommendation, over 20,000 Polish prisoners of war were executed. Thousands right here in Katyn Forest. Nearly 3 years later, after German forces had captured the territory, they exposed the mass graves in their anti-Soviet propaganda. Stalin denied responsibility for years, but subsequent administrations have acknowledged his guilt.
Katyn is still a stumbling block and a focal point, even for the present Russian government. It's still an issue, and justifications are still put forward, even though the guilt has long been recognized. But it's a terrible crime against humanity, a mass killing of prisoners of war for no reason. It shows that the Soviet Union was no better than Hitler's regime, the Third Reich. It seems that the Soviet Union could also secretly send thousands of people to their death without reason, and then try to cover up the crime.
Even as Hitler waged war across half of Europe, Stalin still refused to believe that the Germans would open another front to the east. But his security chief, Lavrenti Beria, was better informed. He had a mole in Nazi high command. Willy Lenin ran the division combating Soviet espionage, while himself spying for Moscow. On the 19th of June 1941, Lenin warned that Germany would invade the Soviet Union in just 3 days' time. When Stalin read the report, he flew into a rage, saying, "You can send your source to his fucking mother. This is not a source, but disinformation."
It was exactly what he didn't want to hear. Stalin had a preconceived view, and he only wanted information that proved him right. In his eyes, any information that contradicts his view comes from incompetent sources.
Willy Lenin was later shot by the Gestapo for spying. The information he passed to the Soviets had been accurate down to the exact date when the Germans would attack the Soviet Union. It was June 22nd, 1941, when Hitler turned east. The Soviets were totally unprepared. Soon after, the first strikes hit the cities of western Ukraine. Lviv prison held over 1,600 political prisoners. The prison was run by Beria's secret police, who had their regional headquarters here. With the German army bearing down on them, they had a problem. What to do with the political prisoners? Their solution was a war crime, later exploited for propaganda purposes by the Germans, and which still provokes outrage today.
In 1941, when the war between the USSR and Germany started, an order came from Moscow to clear the prisons.
As the prisoners waited, 30 or more in each cell, they could hear rushing footsteps coming towards them in the basement. Then, the first explosion.
Grenades were thrown through the cell windows. Then another team came and shot anyone who was still alive. In the first week of the war, the NKVD killed 1,681 people in this prison.
There were a whole lot of reports describing crimes during the retreat of the NKVD. They had orders not to leave any prisoners behind. The security service boss admitted, "I had no transport for them. If I didn't shoot them, I'd get shot myself."
As the German army advanced deep into Soviet territory, the Soviet state demanded complete sacrifice from every quarter. Women worked in factories, on the land, and in civil defense. Some took on another dangerous role, consorting with the enemy to gather intelligence. KGB officers coordinated these efforts.
There were groups of women, many of them married. But these were beautiful women who, under the eye of KGB agents, came into contact, often intimate contact, with foreigners and got information. Certainly, women can fish for information in bed more effectively than men approaching them in the daytime.
The role of Beria's security service was greatly expanded during the war, with the formation of 53 NKVD divisions made up of over 500,000 men and women, both fighting on the front line and against suspected enemies at home.
From the start of the war, the NKVD took control. It dealt with every issue: economics, transport, moving our manufacturing base east to the Ural Mountains away from the front line. They organized the partisan movement. They created their own brigades. They dealt with deserters. They broke through enemy lines. All this was handled by the NKVD.
Under Stalin's direct orders, the NKVD also deported entire ethnic groups suspected of collaboration with the Germans to Siberia and Central Asia. And NKVD troops were stationed behind the front lines to prevent regular army units from retreating or deserting. In the battle for Stalingrad alone, they killed over 13,000 deserters to terrify any who might consider running.
Security bodies were always acting on orders from the top. It was necessary to take extreme measures.
The Soviet Union suffered an estimated 27 million casualties in World War II. Around 18 million of them were civilians. The siege of Leningrad alone cost 1 million civilian lives and lasted well over 2 years. It had caused the greatest destruction and largest loss of life ever known in a modern city. Yet the suffering and heroism in the fight against the German invaders would become a unifying and defining experience for the Soviet Union. To protect the homeland at any cost would have the utmost priority from now on. By April 1945, Hitler's armies were almost defeated. The Soviet assault on Berlin marked the end of World War II in Europe.
Парад Победы – итог героического пути нашего народа, пройденного под водительством великого Сталина.
In the glow of victory, the security services were officially hailed as heroes, and Stalin's ruthless leadership was applauded.
Stalin was the most brutal of all the Soviet leaders. But at the same time, he was the one who achieved the most, it seems. He industrialized Russia, and of course, he was the man who carried them through the Second World War.
But the enforcers of the security services had also played a crucial role. Lavrenti Beria was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union and promoted to Marshal. He was, at the same time, a highly intelligent leader and a brutal executioner. A paradoxical character, a complete enigma.
Beria certainly had positive as well as negative qualities as a government leader and a great organizer. And we can't deny either of these.
There are great piles of documents outlining Beria's many crimes. He was a man who had power and used it. He was also a cruel man with no moral scruples about the use of violence by the authorities.
В аду варится погруженный в шею смолу, по шею Гитлер. Рядом Берия, по пояс. Гитлер его спрашивает: ты как так легко отделался-то? Берия говорит: а я на голову Сталина встал.
Look, it's hard to present Beria as anything other than an extraordinarily awful human being, but he was incredibly efficient. There are some people who try and say Beria and the people like him were not bastards after all, and clearly they were. But then there are others who have a different or more nuanced approach, which is, unfortunately, this was a time when we needed bastards. And this is a different form of revisionism, which is in some ways even more pernicious.
Lavrenti Beria's crowning glory was a secret espionage operation which would change the world's power structure for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. When, at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, American President Truman proudly informed Stalin that the US had developed a new superweapon, Stalin seemed unimpressed. But what Truman, Churchill, nor anyone else in the West knew was that Beria's spies were already amongst the scientists who would achieve this feat and were supplying Moscow with the secret of how to build one of their own.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, no.
The Americans had spent a vast fortune developing the atomic bomb. But Lavrenti Beria and his network of agents and spies matched the threat for a fraction of the cost. And so, they triggered an arms race which would risk the destruction of the planet. The spy game of the Cold War had just begun.